I did another report on Bitcoin versus the global payments industry. And I just really wanted to make the point clear with all these people who have the expectation that within a few years, a large percentage of the global population is going to switch over to using Bitcoin for payments. So I looked into the global stats in there, and I obviously don't recall them off the top of my head, but I had some things where basically if everyone was fully informed today on what their options are for different cross-border payments, then the average fee that people pay for cross-border payments would drop from, and this is just with traditional payments means, it would drop from about 6.2 to 3.2% on average.
Sam, welcome to the show. It is really
Thanks for
awesome
having
to
me.
have you. Yeah, for sure. In fact, you haven't been on the show before, have you?
No.
Have we done a show together? Oh, damn. Well, first time. All right. Even better. It's even more special than I thought. But welcome to the show, man. Give a brief introduction. I mean, I'm sure a good chunk of the audience know who you are, but just in case, give an introduction for yourself.
Yeah, I'm not that famous. I'm not a big author, but I'm I guess like a Bitcoin content creator in general. That's always what I've done, kind of how I got into Bitcoin. I work at River as a research analyst where I've produced a whole bunch of research around just various Bitcoin related topics where there's kind of an overlap between like what is our business interested in, what are our clients interested in, and what's kind of relevant right now. And also pretty hard to find data on. So I guess we're talking about one of those reports a bit today on the Lightning Network.
Yes.
But
yes.
Yeah, very, very passionate about Bitcoin in general and especially education, and really appreciate what you do as well to just contribute to the space in your own way.
Hell yeah. Appreciate that. So what's your role around Lightning? Like, what are your touch points around Lightning, both as far as River goes, and then also just kind of like personally, what's your how does Lightning fit into your life, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I'm like one of the fortunate people who lives in a first world country, I guess. So Lightning is, in a lot of cases, it's a luxury. It's not as much of a necessity. I use it whenever I'm able to. Whenever I can ever pay with Lightning anywhere, I'll do it immediately. Mm-hmm. And I should like I guess you guys say, like, knock on wood, I've never actually had a Lightning payment fail to date.
No kidding.
I've done plenty. So like it'll mess up at some point, but I'm one of those rare individuals on that side of the curve who has never had that issue. Which has nothing to do with skill or knowledge or anything like that. I've just never had it happen. So, and I've used a variety of Lightning wallets, I should add there. So as a user, a big fan of it. I do, of course, like many other people, see the challenges in getting it adopted and getting it in the hands of people who don't understand how all of the technical things work. I'm not a technical person by background, so if people start asking me super technical questions, I'm not going to know the answer in a lot of cases either. And at River, my sort of the way I interface with it is I'm not on the Lightning team itself and busy working on that infrastructure or anything like that. My role is in content, and I guess content is broader, like research is a part of that. And I try to work with the data that we have ourselves because River runs some of the largest nodes on the Lightning Network. And it doesn't make sense for our developers to be the ones who make content around that, because you also, there's a lot that comes to that. They need to be working on the actual infrastructure. Yeah. So I make use of our data for starters because we're just sharing what we have available as well as far as we can, and then aggregating data from around the industry to be able to come up with interesting insights that you can't really read from an outside perspective. If you're just looking at the Lightning Network, everyone's familiar with those sort of standard metrics around the capacity, the number of nodes, the number of channels. But beyond that, people just don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. And that's what we tried to provide a whole bunch of insights into.
Yeah, that's one interesting thing about Lightning is that you can't see payments, if you're not in the route, and even if you're in the route, there's, granted, you can now, currently you can like connect hashes, and potentially if you can see enough of the network, you can put, some split payments and stuff together. But largely it's kind of a black box in a lot of ways.
Which is
so
like a funny part about that as well. As I was at Bitcoin Amsterdam, and a developer said to me, basically, if I do my job well, then your methodologies for your report, they won't work. Like this will be one of the last reports you make on the Lightning Network. But it's
after a year or two, though, with PTLCs and a bunch of things that like are expected to come, it will really kind of mess things up. Like you'll have a hard time.
I mean, I don't mind. I'd rather have the privacy improved than
best
be able
reason,
to say,
right?
like, hey guys, I've got an amazing report again here. Like,
you'll just give a report that says my report has been obsoleted.
Yeah.
Oh man. That's cool. That's kind of neat to hear, honestly. As sad as it will be to lose that information, it's cool to see the privacy start to. I mean, we already see like kind of hints of it. Like, and you talk about it, that you kind of had to reach out to people in the industry to get the data because you can't see it. So, like, what kind of a task is that? How many people did you reach out to? How many companies? And what's kind of the process of putting that together? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, I think probably about 40-ish people, like nodes, companies, etc. And a lot of them obviously go like, yeah, but you work at River, you guys run some of the biggest nodes. Aren't you going to abuse this data to get some kind of unfair advantage? Like, people are legit concerned about it, even though the space is still it's relatively small.
Mm-hmm.
And, like it's all about growing the space in general. And that's really how we've tried to position the report as well. It's for everyone. But still, some people are concerned, like, yeah, but, you guys have a bit of a team. Aren't you going to abuse this in some kind of way? And I was very clear about it, and very honestly, like nobody besides me ever got to look at the data, at any of the raw data. And nobody has access to it either. So I've just really kept that, not out of like, I don't want to share, guys, but just out of respect for everyone who shared it. That was the agreement. And I've kept to that. And that is one of the reasons why some people wanted to share their data, even though they otherwise might not. And then one of the things that helped to convince people who ended up sharing was that a lot of the data points were aggregated. So it's not like we are in the report comparing, like, this is how Bitfinex is doing with its nodes compared to like to the async node, for example, compared to another node compared to us, because people just start sort of thinking about those companies as competitors in a way, and they start benchmarking all of this stuff. And that's not really the goal. It's not to say this is the very best node out there. And by aggregating the information, a lot more companies were interested. There were also plenty that, like didn't even bother to respond. Obviously, that always happens no matter where you reach out or what you try to do. But it's just a lot of, just the standard project management of chasing up on people. And one of the hardest parts was getting good data on like a very specific time frame, because I tried to focus on August 2023. And from that month, I needed the data from as many participants as possible. And then you'll get some people who are not responding, or they only send like part of the data and whatnot. And then, it takes a lot of following up to figure things out, and then making sure that all of the data they provide you is also in the same format, everything works together. So it's a whole bunch of that fun stuff that happens behind the scenes, where ultimately the result that people get is just like one little graph that looks good. And behind that graph,
is like a line or two. Like,
and behind that graph, there will be like 100 hours. Yep. Exactly.
That's great. Oh man. Well, we very much appreciate that you do the hard work so that I can read a simple report and make sense out of things. But that's a really good point too, is that, and I appreciate that approach, is that, this isn't about companies and comparing companies. Like, it's a report about the Lightning Network. Is what's happening with the Lightning Network, not some node or some business around it. And it's just another interesting like kind of element to the whole thing, is that you have to you don't know what's going on in somebody else's node, and essentially looking inside somebody else's node is the only way that you can kind of have an image of this thing, because of the nature of the onion routing of it all. Like even when you look at all the privacy attacks, everybody's it almost inevitably. And it's so funny, like people's like, oh, there's a really terrible one, and I'll read another thing, and get into it. It's like, oh God, this is the one that's going to be a pain and it's going to take a year to fix or whatever. And then I just found out that it's like, oh, if you have a channel with like 800 different people, or you have like, assuming you have 20,000 nodes all spread out through the network, you can X. And I'm like, okay, so basically if it's going through your node, you can see stuff. That's always been the case. But it's just kind of an interesting to see a direct example of like, if you don't, they don't tell you, you don't know. Which is good. It's cool to see a privacy layer start to kind of prove itself in a sense that this is the reality. So I'm curious, what was the biggest thing that was surprising to you that you weren't expecting to find?
I wasn't expecting as much growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I really had to like run through the numbers probably a dozen times just to make sure, like, is this actually correct? Because it seems like, like on the one hand, it seems like a lot of growth. At the same time, it is still a relatively small network in the grand scheme of payment networks.
Mm-hmm.
But the growth just looked better than what you like. I guess like that's where a lot of the criticism on Lightning comes from. Everyone looks at those standard metrics of the number of channels, of the capacity, etc., and those have been relatively flat. So when you see that flatten out, you just automatically, you can't help it. It's just human psychology. You think to yourself, well, that must mean that the activity has been relatively flat too. Yeah. But it hasn't been the case. We're just doing far more with the same capacity, with the same number of channels. And that's a trend I would probably expect to continue. We're not going to see, I would expect another 1,200% growth in the same time frame too soon. It could happen. I mean, all depends what happens to the Bitcoin price as well, ultimately. But it's just been pretty staggering in a 2-year time frame. So that was a big one for me. And then seeing how at least from our nodes perspective, and a few of the others that shared as well, but whose data isn't in the report, just seeing payment success rate has gone up quite significantly. That's pretty exciting to see as well, because that's really just a thing that, it needs to work as many nines after the comma as possible. Like as close to 100% as possible, essentially, for it to really be reliable. And, if it would still be failing like 3% of the time, that is just too much for mainstream adoption in a way. So, that's a really exciting trend to see. And I wasn't expecting as much of a jump there either, that it got that much more reliable, at least from some of the perspectives that I could tell from the data that was shared.
Do you remember the stat specifically on that? I mean, obviously the title of it is that it grew 1,212% in that span of time. But
on reliability, I have the report here next to me as well, in case I need to look anything up. Figured that would be handy. But I sort of recall off the top of my head, I think I was only allowed to share our own data on the reliability part, because it gets a little more sensitive once you start lumping in others. But basically in August 2022, so that was a year before I did the report, payments were failing through our nodes, etc., roughly 2.5% of the time. So that's still pretty often. And then August 2023, it was down to like 0.2% of the time or so. So that's only our perspective. Obviously, people who have small nodes who are not as well connected, their percentage might be higher. But if the trend is looking up for us, then the chances are pretty high that they've improved across the board, I think. And that was also reflected in the data I could at least look at from other companies. But there were a few data points like that where they're like, can you not publish anything about this? It's really just for your context to be able to write in the report, but we don't want to put our exact numbers in there.
I'm curious.
That's a pretty awesome improvement there.
Yeah, that's a huge difference in that span of time, especially considering, quote unquote, liquidity is largely flat on the outside. Like, I mean, I think it did change a little bit, but respective to the number of payments, obviously, it's a huge difference, which suggests that it's the management of that liquidity and or something more specific in like routing and like. Do you have any like concrete evidence on like what changes might have resulted in that? Or is it just kind of, you think, better management across the board? Like we just understand the tools better?
I would think like part is going to be the understanding of the tools. I would imagine that a lot of the people who have been using Lightning over the past years have, the people who kind of adopt it and then just keep using it. So after a while, they learn what works and what doesn't. That plays a pretty big role in there,
That's
I think.
a good point. Yeah.
And obviously, like wallets would, from their perspective, also be able to see like what's our retention rate here and how often, are we getting, even things like support tickets or issues being raised of payments failing. Like they'll have pretty good insights on this from their own perspective too. But I think like it's part is learning more about the tools. It's part the tools just getting better. It's part like even super simple adoption things of like, oh, I shouldn't send a payment to someone who is like, if they're non-custodial, obviously, if they're offline. Like people will do that wrong once. If they go to a store somewhere, the other person, they also had a non-custodial wallet, they try to send a payment and the person's phone is offline or at home or whatever random thing you can imagine. People learn that stuff too. Like, okay, I shouldn't do that because it doesn't work. So, it can be in the little things there that add up at the edges and that can make a little bit of a difference too. And obviously just software updates in general to all of the infrastructure over the past years will have made a meaningful impact as well. We used to still have like, in the logs, you can see specific reasons why a transaction failed. It's not as detailed as you would like, but it will, for example, tell you that it wasn't able to find a route or that there's some kind of error that the instructions that your node receives basically to pass the payment on, that there was some kind of issue in there. And that used to still happen in the earlier years where there were a whole bunch of transactions that wouldn't go through because, maybe people manually coded up some implementation or whatever, or had their own rules around things and that wasn't actually compatible with Lightning, or there were bugs in software. So those used to happen, those payments, and they've completely disappeared. It's really just about can't find a route to this other node because they're probably offline, or we're timing out when trying to find a route, which is very often due to liquidity issues, as you raised.
Yeah. Fascinating. Now, I'm curious, did you, and without obviously saying anything about any particular company, did you find huge variations in like, was it obvious that this node was specifically doing vastly more with the exact same amount of liquidity?
Oh, yeah.
Or was having vastly different payment failures?
Yeah.
Even though like that's something that they were doing clearly, some policy or the way they treat it was giving them a much better operation of the network when you
I think on the failure side of things, a bit harder to tell because I don't know what kind of internal measures they have either for their, like, are they automatically closing and opening channels? Like there's no way for me to tell that unless you do an interview with the company and really figure out like what is it exactly that you're doing. But then you get into the realm of, hey, but you work at River, where you're trying to reverse engineer our infrastructure. That gets a bit sensitive, I guess.
Yeah.
But on the efficiency side of things, like absolutely a massive difference. And this is basically one of the methods I used to get estimations of how much volume is going through the network, because you can kind of see like what's the capacity that's on a node, like how much of that is being turned over on a monthly basis, for example, or even a daily basis, or whatever it is that you're looking for. And with some nodes, that is about 15% per month. So let's say you have 1 Bitcoin on your Lightning node, then you might be routing about 0.15 Bitcoin in a month. I believe it was a month, if I recall correctly. Might have been a year, but I'll have to check up on that. But I believe it was a month. And then there's other ones that do about 200% of their capacity in the same time frame. So they're basically performing like 12, or was it like a little bit, it might be a little bit more, like 13, 14 times better or so than some of the inefficient ones. So that basically means there's a bunch of nodes out there that have tons of capacity, but they're not really managing it. They're like, they've got just capacity sitting in unused channels. There's never really any Bitcoin flowing through it, and they're just not really bothering with it too much. And then you have some of the, like, as you can imagine, a lot of the bigger companies in the space that are very active, like they just manage this stuff so much better, and they have huge capital efficiency. And with River, I think we did share our own numbers on this as well. Like it's basically about 200% is what we're doing, kind of there in the upper range of efficiency. just from paying attention to where the Bitcoin's at. And we very often do some kind of like, we'll call it summer cleaning or spring cleaning, or it basically happens at every season. But we just close out all the channels that are not meeting the expectations and then just reopen new ones where it makes sense. And the first time we did that, people freaked out because the capacity on the network dropped quite significantly. And then we started communicating about it like, sorry, guys, we should be clear here. We are just, there are no issues with the river. We're just closing out channels to help increase our capital efficiency, and ultimately is for our own security as well. Because all the Bitcoin you have on the Lightning Network, it's like it's connected to a hot wallet. You are taking a risk there. And as a company, even though they're our own funds, they're not client funds. So we never risk that. But they're our own funds, and we are still interested in protecting those, obviously.
Yeah, that's a good point, is that, you essentially have node and key management risk for anything that you have exposed. So it's not merely a matter of, capital efficiency. I mean, obviously you want to be making fees on every sat that you have locked up into this thing. But at the exact same time, if you're not making fees, you certainly don't want it to be locked up in it. If you only have 0.15 Bitcoin moving through one Bitcoin channel, you need to figure out how to either get that other 0.85 active or get it into cold storage again, because it's not working for you. That's interesting. It's not totally surprising that there would be like a big gap like that, but it's still interesting that it is that much. That is a little crazy.
And I think I thought it was a surprising insight as well. And I think that the key insight for sort of individual hobbyists, because they will potentially more often be at the lower range as well if they're not as well connected, because you're not getting volume from those big nodes. But a lot of people have historically had this perspective from Lightning of, I could just park my Bitcoin in there and then it's automatically going to make me money with very little downside risk. But those can kind of be the expectations that if you literally just put it in there, that, over the course of a month, you might make a small percentage of all the Bitcoin that you are putting on there. And you are obviously paying fees for opening and closing channels. So unless you are just actively involved in it and making smart decisions, then it's probably not going to pay off for now. It's, it can be fun to do. It's a great learning experience. But if you want to make actual money, then it's going to take a little bit more than just passively having it sitting there.
Yeah. So speaking of doing more than passively having it sit there, are most of the adjustments? Let's take River for example, since you're there. What adjustments are being made in that sense? Is it basically just manual? Like you just see what channels are active and leave those and close and rework the channels that aren't? Or is there something more automatic? Like, is there a management software that's doing part of the job? Like, is it still basically just hands-on? Let me look at what I see on my screen and then make adjustments according.
I think it's probably for most people, it will start out manually just to understand, like, what is it that I'm doing? And when I say for most people, I mean, like, people who are actually interested in the tech. For any, individual that has no idea about, how Lightning works in general, but the technical side of things, they will, I would imagine in the future, always use some kind of automated solution that does everything like this for them in the back end. With that said, they would much more likely just, if they're just an individual that's trying to transact on Lightning, they'll just have one channel. They will use something like splicing to be able to resize that channel. And like, they're never going to open and close channels. They will just be connected to, call it like a few hubs that are going to be around. So, it doesn't even apply to those people necessarily, but for, big node operators at the moment, I'm guessing like for most, it just starts out manually, just understanding like what are the parameters that we want to use to make decisions on. Like, what's the expectation that we have of activity in a channel? Are there certain peers that are never sending anything our way? It's all just one-sided. And that's just not like what we're looking for to keep our liquidity balance out. So you just gather rules gradually over time when you start to understand how things flow. And then based on those rules, eventually pretty much every company either creates their own software to make these decisions on an automated basis, or they use some kind of existing software, because those solutions obviously have started emerging. And in the report, there's also a big industry map, and there is, like a variety of node management software listed in there. Some of those offer these types of solutions.
Yeah, the rise of LSPs just in general has been crazy, and that could be attributable to a lot of what's gone in just the last 2 years.
Yep.
Is like, it went from like Breeze was kind of setting it up and like a lot of people were talking about it, to basically every non-custodial wallet that I use is an LSP model, like all of them on mobile,
Yep.
essentially. And the only exception to that is the one connected to my BTC Pay server, which isn't that's not the wallet. It's just a front end. And so on that note, you mentioned splicing specifically, because one of the big things in the last, I guess, it's not even been that many months, really. Maybe 4 or 5 months. I can't remember exactly when this happened.
Feels like 4 or 5 years, but yeah, I hear you.
It does. Was that Phoenix, which has been my main wallet on mobile for a long time, they switched over to splicing. I went from like 22 channels, because I used it heavily, to one channel, and it's fascinating, one, just to see like the resource cost. Like the wallet performs better. Obviously it has a whole lot less of a intensive process in finding routes and trying to do things, when it doesn't have to look at doesn't have to start from 22 channels and then start branching out from there. But are you guys using splicing? When did you guys start using it, if you are? And is that, again, something that's largely, are there automated tools for this, or is this still kind of the very beginning where much of that needs to be done manually?
Yeah, it's the latter of, like, it's still relatively new. The Phoenix team, I think, was the first to implement it.
Okay.
And I haven't actually checked in a while if there have been any other wallets that have done it as well. And it's kind of one of those, like, a trend I've noticed with Lightning wallets that a lot of people have followed is a lot of Bitcoiners will just ask around, like, what Lightning wallet are you using? And then there tends to be a few that are the most popular, and kind of everyone uses that. And then over time, like, some kind of issue emerges with that, like either they shut down or they're not actually using Lightning, it seems, behind the scenes. And then people will just switch over to the next one. So with Phoenix as well, I've been using that for quite a while now, and you're perfectly happy with it. And then it's not like, let me go investigate which other wallets are using splicing at the moment, if they've adopted it, so they can start using that. So it's kind of people tend to stick with what they've been using for a while, I guess. So I'm not actually aware if others have implemented it yet. I know one of our people's looking at it. I don't know where the stage of that is, to be honest. Like if we're already like coding something up for it to be able to use it. I don't have any insight there. I should have probably checked that before this episode, but currently not aware. A couple too many things on my mind.
Yeah, I should have sent you the question ahead of time. I should have let you know what we were going to talk about, right?
Yeah, also possible.
I'm curious, did you... it seems to me that, LND has still been the most popular client to use, the most popular backend. But did you find anything interesting or unexpected there? And is also River using LND? And on top of that backend client, what viewer, like what interface or whatever, are you using? Or is it just like command line? Do you know?
I'm pretty sure we're using LND. I'm sure we are. I do know that in general, we're looking at all of the implementations on a consistent basis to see like what they're updating, what they're doing. As far as interface, I'm trying to think, because that's the part where I haven't been as involved. Obviously, I just take the data that they spit out and put into our dashboards, into our database. So I don't think I actually know. It would not surprise me, given that our Lightning team, they're all just hardcore into the code, that they just do a ton of stuff through command line. We do have, for River Lightning clients, a dashboard from which they can just manage their own things. And I think we have a couple of features in there as well that our developers might use if they're trying to manage their own nodes. But honestly, like, it wouldn't surprise me with these guys if they're just doing stuff the way they feel best.
All typed commands. Commands. How have you seen user change, like on River specifically? Like what kind of, let's say the last year? I think there was something about this in the report. It's been like 2 months since I read it. Like how have you seen the River user base change how often and how they use both Lightning and then the service because of Lightning?
I think the service because of Lightning, it's historically, like, we were one of the first exchanges to adopt it back in 2019, like to integrate deposits and withdrawals. And people tend to like, I think in general, just seeing like, let's say with Phoenix, like they're the first ones to have splicing. This always attracts people to see like, okay, they're forward thinking, they're trying to push Bitcoin forward, and people are naturally interested in that. Of course, over time, a lot more different exchanges have also adopted Lightning and done that. So I'd say at this point, it's less of a USP than it was in the past. It's much more kind of an anti-USP if you don't have it at this point. If you still don't have Lightning and people look at your solution, it's like, okay, you don't have it. I guess I'll use practically anything else that does have it if they're interested in Lightning. So it's a bit hard to measure because we don't hear a lot from people that they're like, some people are enthusiastic about Lightning, obviously, and they'll tell us, but you don't really hear from people who go like, I went with you guys because these other guys didn't have Lightning.
Yeah.
That's not really the reason people tend to bring up. But I'm sure it happens to a certain degree. As for how people interact with it, because we operate in the US, and again, first world country, though I guess nowadays people talk about the ascending world and the descending world. So, first world on
its way down. It's the third world on its way up. Yeah,
exactly. I think, it's again, it's a bit of a luxury, and at the same time, it's not a luxury because of the rules that exist around it of, every payment is a taxable event. So that in general causes a lot of frustration with people to really pick up and start using it more. So in general, one of the things I suspect, I haven't been able to confirm that in the report and all of the data I have, because there's no IP addresses linked to this and no geographical data of any kind. But I suspect a lot of the adoption has been outside the US. And where I was able to confirm that a bit was through Thunder Games data, which is also in the report, to just see where is their activity coming from, where are people playing these games, running some sets, and that it's largely outside the US as well.
Gotcha.
So,
this show is brought to you by the Cold Card hardware wallet. My favorite setup, which I know I talk about a lot, is the Nunchuck wallet on mobile that just connects directly to, or just talks NFC whenever I need to sign. The Nunchuck does not hold my keys. It is securely on my Cold Card, not connected to the internet, not vulnerable to a phishing email or any malware or anything like that. If I ever need to send a transaction, I just create the transaction on my Nunchuck wallet, and I tap it to my Cold Card, I hit sign, I tap it again, and then off it goes. There is no easier interface and way of interacting that grants a higher level of security, in my opinion, than that right there. It's genuinely incredible to me that we even have this capability in the Bitcoin space. And CoinKite has just made an entire suite of fascinating security and just fun Bitcoin devices and hardware products, like the block clock. Just connect it to your node and have it show the Bitcoin price, have it show the block height, just right there on your desk in this really cool package. If you haven't checked out what they have to offer, you definitely need to. And when you go over there, do not forget that I have a 9% discount code. Bitcoin Audible, all one word, gets you 9% off. And you can go through the link in the show notes, or just remember the discount code, which is not hard. It's just the name of the show. You can go through the link in the show notes to go right there, or just go to the store, browse around, see what you want, get yourself a solid hardware wallet, experience the tap to send with a Cold Card hardware wallet. It's just kind of magical. And get notified for the Q1. I'm really stoked about my Cypherpunk BlackBerry, the new model that's going to be coming out. So check that out as well. Don't forget, 9% off. The link is right in the show notes. Go check them out.
What do you think the biggest challenges that are still here? Like, what are Lightning's continued biggest challenges? And probably as a follow-up to that, how do you think our view of Lightning has changed over the last few years?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. On the biggest challenge that's still here, there were two questions that were both great, I think. On the challenge that's still here, everyone will raise it. It's just the liquidity thing. It's not intuitive for the average person to think in this way. And speaking of Phoenix Wallet earlier, not to criticize them in any way, but they released some kind of update to help people with this, to help them with liquidity. But it's not written in a way that the average person will understand. And someone made a great mock-up of in the app, I mean there. Someone made a great mock-up of this is what it should actually ask you. It should ask you how much Bitcoin or how much volume in payments do you expect to get on a monthly basis or something. That's in terms people can think about. But if you ask them how many sats do you want to get in liquidity, people just or what do you want to set up or how much do you want to buy, etc. People are just
what is that?
Why do I have to do this? This is very confusing.
I have a homework assignment. Yeah.
Yeah. And it could be that the team is already working on this, that they've seen that they agree with it. And, at least they have some of these features and other wallets don't. So definitely by no means throwing shade at them. I think it's good that they are working this thing out. But then you also hear back from the community that says hey, this is not the most logical way to do this. It will probably confuse beginners. And there's just definitely a big hurdle there in helping users understand how this stuff works, that it's still Bitcoin. Ultimately, when you show someone in person how to do a Lightning payment, it looks super simple. But the moment they start trying to figure some more things out around it, they actually want to know how it works. If they should be running their own node and whatnot. It's not that there aren't plenty of tutorials. It's just that so much of this stuff is over people's heads.
Yeah.
So for now, to me, it feels at large scale still like a tool for Bitcoiners. And it's a great, super flashy, amazing, well-performing tool to introduce beginners to it, but to really get them over that hump and to get them to become power users in a way, or to just use it frequently, that can still be pretty tricky to help people understand the power of it. And in some places that's going amazing, where you have circular economies around it and where you really have someone on the ground just holding people by the hands to walk them through all these processes. But at large, that's I guess part of why it's still in its relatively early stages, is people are just struggling to figure out, should I be using it? And historically, especially over the past years, fees have been relatively low. So the need hasn't been there as much. And that obviously plays a big role in will people even bother to use it, paired with the fact that a lot of exchanges weren't supporting it yet. And some of the biggest ones still aren't. So, for a lot of people, that's if they're a Coinbase user, for example, that is their interface with Bitcoin. That's all they know. And there are a couple of other wallets like this where that's just all they know. That's how they interact with Bitcoin. And many of them won't even transact on-chain in a lot of cases. So they're never going to figure out what Lightning is and play around with it if they don't install a separate Lightning wallet. And how do you educate the user on, hey, the wallet that you have, it doesn't have Lightning functionality, but there is this thing called the Lightning Network that exists, allows you to make those payments very quickly and cheaply across long distances. And it's just tricky to educate people on that, because they'll feel but why do I, if they don't have a use case, why do I need this? Why should I do that?
Yeah. Especially if they're really using Coinbase as their wallet to go pay for stuff. They didn't even understand why that's a terrible idea.
They just see it as an investment and aren't using it for payments. So I think in general, to your question, where is what are the big challenges still? It's just that Bitcoin does not currently have a sort of a product market fit as a medium of exchange in most places. There are absolutely some places where this is growing and where people are doing amazing work. But a lot of the sort of people who have seen this as an investment historically just don't use it to pay for stuff, which is always a bit of a chicken and egg problem. And then you have regulations thrown in the US as well that just makes it really annoying to be able to do payments without having to deal with all the tax implications of that. So those things, they all play a role, but in practice, the reality is that it's just not as much of a medium of exchange yet as a lot of people would like it to be. There's tons of enthusiasm around this and people really want to make it happen. And I applaud all those efforts. But the reality is just that that's like an uphill battle at the moment. It's not we're not scrambling to keep up with the users. It's like really figuring out like the other way around. Like, how do we make them want to use this stuff? Yeah. Exactly. So I think that's absolutely still a big challenge. And then I think your second question was on, trying to recall. Could you repeat it for me if you remember?
Yeah, I'll actually make a comment on that and then bring back that other question. Oh, so I've been reading a book called The Cold Start Problem. I'm not sure if you've read it.
No, I've heard about it. I think I know the overall
it's
thesis.
Really good. It's really good. I've been going down a different rabbit hole in my audiobooks recently, and this is kind of at the beginning of a list. But one of the things that was really interesting to me is because this person, I can't even remember the author's name right now, was like really high up and really involved in Uber and thinking about how they set up their networks. And that, most people usually think of network effects as positive things when for a huge portion of the time, they're actually deeply negative. They actually work against you because if you don't have a certain network density, then even the people who come and join can't use it for anything, and then they leave immediately. And you talked about this concept of the atomic network, and I find it interesting that you were saying that like in the context of like people actually using it on the ground and like merchant adoption and stuff, is that they are happening in certain places, but broadly it's still non-existent, or it's still just like not there. But what's funny is this is one of the things that they specifically attacked at Uber, is that they knew that like if they could have 10,000 drivers, but if it was 5 drivers in 2,000 cities, it was the most useless network in the world. But if they had 100 drivers or 200 drivers in one city, if they had that network density, well, then they can actually build out an atomic network. They can build out a network that's large enough in a small place that it can actually sustain itself. And then they kind of prove the case, and then they can do it again in the next city, like right next door. And it's funny that it kind of seems like both in the context of like merchant adoption and Lightning, but even in general in Bitcoin, really, that seems to be kind of happening naturally.
Yeah, absolutely.
That we've seen that in like El Salvador. And do you have any more kind of insight on specifically what you are seeing there? And is that, am I correct? Like, am I thinking that I see something that I see, or is it like, do you have any input on maybe that thought, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways of kind of approaching that problem. It's like the way you're saying from Uber, it's kind of planned by the company. Obviously, like they produce a strategy around this and then act on that. And that's how you're seeing it in Lightning space too, where activity gathers around specific solutions that companies have built. And there's obviously a lot in podcasting and whatnot, as one example, and in gaming as another example. So that's one angle of it. The other is just the physical angle of, hey, we're here locally together. We can pay each other for goods and services in Bitcoin. And those just tend to be powerful. So it has to be a concept or a place that sort of ties people together, or like a certain activity. And that makes it take off, because then people start feeling a reason and a need to use it. And it just makes them feel far more involved. You get a much stronger bond as a result. The habit is more easily created. So I guess like it's just naturally the way that humans organize themselves and sort of see a need to really start picking something up. And my guess would be that just the kind of use cases or the uses where either of those factors don't really exist, that's where the adoption will be more limited. Like just a person at home, if they could buy their things with Lightning online, and there's plenty of stores, and I see on your microphone you have Bitrefill there, for example. There's people who can do that, but they need to make that connection of, hey, this store exists and I can go pay there, and I know what I can get there. But for the average consumer at home that has a Lightning wallet and that doesn't know about that company, they're not going to make the connection of, hey, I should go to this website now, and instead of just directly buying a thing on a site here, I can actually pay over Lightning for it through them, for example.
Yeah.
So Yeah, I think like that's kind of my thoughts on that.
It's kind of funny too, especially in just reading that book. The section I just got through was talking about Slack and how they had the exact same like realization in building it out, because Slack is like it was essentially built as like, how do we fix all the problems of the IRC when they created it. And one of the things they did is they target like, okay, rather than trying to get a bunch of different people in different companies, let's go to one company and see if we can't get like 100 people in this business using it, because they actually they measured a threshold of how likely are you to get a response and how much time is there going to be in getting a response, that it needs to be under this threshold or whatever to actually keep people coming back to it, looking for the notification or looking for the update in the conversation. And it's funny in using like Keat, and then in using like protocols like Nostr and Lightning, it's almost crazy to think like how big of a challenge this is from a company perspective. It's almost like, how does a protocol ever get off the ground?
It's playing life on hard mode if you go decentralized. Yeah.
It's so nuts to think about, because you don't really have any of that advantage of like targeting, like how to keep it alive. Like you just kind of have to hope that the community does this itself, that it naturally pulls from that.
That it starts sort of marketing and spreading it and evangelizing it towards people who have specific interests and goals. I think might have been Mark Andreessen who wrote about this like a long time ago, related to this kind of chicken and egg problem. Like, how do you solve that? How do you get to like, if you're creating some kind of marketplace, for example, or something that needs a network effect, like how do you get people going in that? And it was always, like you said here, it's like focusing on a specific sort of subgroup, like a niche area in which people feel very strongly about something. And that's like for Nostr, for example, that was the Bitcoin crowd. Like it's just a really, very vocal group of people with strong beliefs that band together there. The risk that you then get, of course, is that it creates some kind of echo chamber if it doesn't really branch out. But obviously, like people in Bitcoin have broad interests, and they are trying to accomplish a wide variety of goals for just communities and people around the world that don't have access to financial services or that are being oppressed in some kind of way. So you can start pulling in those sort of adjacent communities as well that can then grow out. And that is what helps the network grow ultimately. So as long as that kind of exists and there is a clear link between that solution that's being created and kind of those different communities or different groups of people that are having problems with things, then it can grow. If that's not really there, like if we were all into, I don't know, like VR or something, that's not going to necessarily solve a problem for people that are being oppressed in lots of different places. It's harder to band those people together. So then you need to go find whole other groups of people that are somehow, that were somehow solving those problems for.
Yeah, the commonality is easier because the money problem is widespread and disparate among communities. So there is that like kind of connecting branch. And then the other good thing, I think, that particularly like the things like Keat and Nostr, Keat is just a chat app, but Hypercore and Nostr is that even focusing, like thinking about it from the context of like the atomic network, is that Bitcoin, like you said on Nostr, Bitcoin is that atomic network, is that if we keep focusing on that, the good thing is that the Bitcoin network itself will continue to grow, which will make Nostr a great place to aggregate, to pull together. So you have the other good, one of the positive effects of the network effect in the operation of these is that the Bitcoin network effect benefits these other ones and vice versa. So despite all of the cold start problems that you have in both, they do at least feedback on each other in a positive way when they work.
Agreed.
So going back to the second question of the original thing that got this whole thread started, was how do you think our view or perception of Lightning has changed and or will continue to change? Like, what do you see going forward as well?
Yeah, I've been like a lot of other people, you see all the discussions online about how things in Bitcoin have been developing over the past years. People are a little bit more divided these days on a lot of those topics. Or at least, some people will try to make it look that way, kind of like in politics in a way. Like everyone's really like they're strong opposing camps. And in reality, like let's call it 95% of the people are kind of just looking at a couple of people shouting at each other and going like, wow, those guys are crazy. I think like as a result, people have become aware, like, okay, and more conscious and just talking a little bit more about the issues that Lightning has and the challenges that it has, because we are a couple of years later, and then people just start looking, like in a way, from my perspective, also people look for something to blame. Like, why don't we have billions of users on Bitcoin yet? It must be Lightning's fault. It's like, well, like, again, like not really, because while on-chain fees were low, blocks weren't full necessarily. So it's just really clear that the medium of exchange use case is relatively limited today. And even if Lightning worked perfectly for anyone on the planet, that doesn't mean that everyone would be using it. Like people are still struggling to wrap their heads around that, and they want to blame the technology. They want to pick out a group of developers and be like, "Hey, it's your fault. You guys pushed through this thing with your with all of your technical plans and things, but it didn't accomplish."
Segwit did it.
It didn't accomplish the global scale that we wanted, and it's like. You can shout at people or try to blame people or whatever, but what are we going to accomplish with that? I don't think too much. It's just like the way I personally look at Lightning is no matter what happens next, we've learned a ton from it. And from all of the research that I could do or that I've done, I could really see that everyone who is trying to build like any kind of scalability solution, they are all looking at how can it interact with Lightning in some kind of way? How can it be interoperable? We're not trying to compete with it. We're just building on some of the strengths that it has, trying to do something different, making different trade-offs, and learning from the things that didn't work well over there. And there's still so much about Lightning itself that can be improved. But of course, some people, they just want Bitcoin to go to the moon. They want to make a whole bunch of money, and they want good narratives. Like, Bitcoin can actually handle global scale payment traffic. So you should all buy it. Like, they just want these kinds of narratives, not to actually use it themselves in all cases, but just anything that makes the thing look amazing. And it can be hard for people to look at like tweets, Nostr posts or whatever, like wherever people are shouting that the thing needs to be fixed as soon as possible. It can be really easy to kind of get dragged into that and to start believing that, yes, this is super urgent. We must fix this at global scale within the next 3 years, or we're in deep trouble. People get sort of lost in that train of thought and get very worked up about it. And then people just start getting vocal online and start shouting at each other and making it a bigger deal than it is. Yeah. But in general, I think we're going to learn a ton from Lightning. I'm like, from my perspective, I'm pretty sure. I think it's very likely that it's going to stick around for a long time, because it just does solve, especially at a business scale, like for businesses, even for exchanges to just easily settle among each other. There's just so many different things it is useful for, whether it's going to be like a consumer solution in the long run, remains to be seen. And, maybe other things will emerge, build on top of it or related to it, or would just do something completely different. But I don't think it's been as much of a waste of time or anything like that as some people try to position it to kind of further their own agenda in various ways. So I look at it very positively, and I am, there's a ton of super smart people working on it that are solving the hard problems. And I definitely wouldn't bet against them either, to see like what can they figure out, how can they improve it. So in general, I think it's been amazing for Bitcoin, and I'm very curious to see what more comes out of it.
Yeah. Something I've been talking about for a couple of years on the show is that like it seemed to me that the way things were going and where Lightning was going to be insanely powerful was as a business, financial services, and like mobile and application services infrastructure. That it is going to be a incredible payment infrastructure for the pro user that is providing something at another layer, like at another level, like where, the game developer puts up with slightly more complexity, or puts up with a lot more complexity and issues in how they operate than the user does. The user wants everything fed to them. And in that sense that, in fact, Chris Dixon has a really interesting piece that I just stumbled upon the other day. I think it was mentioned in one of the books. It might even have been in Cold Start. I don't know. I'm listening to like 3 books at once. It's a little bit hard to go back and forth.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But Chris Dixon has a piece from 2010 that is titled, and I was immediately like, oh, I got to save this and check this out just from the title. But I started reading through it, and it's really good. I might do it on the show. But it says, like I said, from 2010, it says the next big thing is going to look like a toy. And it's about the idea that when something starts out, it's going to be used in some niche or kind of like silly or kind of like toy use case to kind of prove that it does the job. And then it's going to be upgraded out of that era, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like when it finally becomes serious infrastructure, it's going to be something different. And one of the things that I've noticed about Lightning is that, and this is something that Ben DeCarmen talked about in the Obla.news post that he did recently about like the challenges, like all the issues with Lightning, or rethinking Lightning is what it was called. Also on the show last week, was that, how did you put it? At scale. That's what it was. Is that Lightning Network from a end user non-custodial perspective has lots of trouble, like it has a lot of issues. But after you scale up to your node to a certain point, and you kind of have like a certain position on the network, like you kind of get almost like you have to bootstrap how your node talks to the network, like its connections. Then it works phenomenally. Like it's like night and day between the various challenges. Like once you solve the liquidity problem largely for yourself and what's going through it, management is vastly easier on the other side of that. And so at scale, so it seems like this like middle scale, like kind of a prosumer or it's almost like Lightning has the potential to open up this space of service provision and payments and kind of financial services. I mean, it's silly to call it that because, it's software and these aren't going to be banks. These are going to be, this is going to be an ecosystem of people trying to, it's going to be like people hosting websites and saying they're holding broadcast communication services. Like, well, no, they're making websites. So we have to think about it differently from that perspective, but that there's going to be this entire landscape of service provision that's just been untouchable for so long because you haven't had this open permissionless network to build on top of. But the end user is the one that gets all of the problems. And that's why like things like the LSP model have been so successful and so necessary at the same time. So at the end of the day, I think it seems more likely, and maybe this long rant here is just, I'm asking if you agree or if you see something different, is that the user is going to end up largely interacting with a layer 3. Or maybe you could say that it's a second layer, it's a different layer 2, and that Lightning is kind of the interoperable communication web between these things. Fediment being obviously the prime example, but I think we don't really know what that's going to look like. I think it's going to be a huge, diverse ecosystem of those things, and Lightning is going to be kind of that joint communication channel. It'll be the language that makes them all feel like they work together, even though they're separate.
Yeah, and I think that's something I've historically seen in Bitcoin as well. Is that there is no roadmap, but if you are sort of technical enough to understand what just various developers around the community are talking about and what kind of direction they're thinking, then I would say, I can't speak for all of Bitcoin, obviously, but I would say that there is a general belief at the moment that is the likely direction that we're growing in, that, either some kind of adjacent L2 or a potential layer 3 like solution, or both at the same time is also very likely. But that's the kind of direction people are expecting the next explorations in. And then again, people can go and freak out and be like, everyone needs to be able to use this and the fees need to be super low for everyone. Still, remains to be seen a bit whether that's the case, or like how urgent that is. We would all love for people to be using Bitcoin, but there are just limitations and challenges to figure out there, and they take time. And people have this perspective that, oh yeah, if developers wouldn't be working on Lightning, then I'm sure they could just, instantly within a few months come up with something better. Like, why don't you guys abandon that and go do something else? And it's like, that's not how it works either, man. It's tricky. So I think
high time preference, man. Time preference. It's everywhere.
Exactly. It's like, that's the kind of sense that I'm getting in general with the direction that people are thinking in. Similar thing with, I think you had a episode about BitVM recently. Similar kind of thinking there. Like, we could just try things out there instead of implementing something like drive changes. Try it out on BitVM, which doesn't need any consensus changes. And maybe we learn interesting things from them, like whether something works or whether it doesn't work. And based on that, we learn and we grow and we either implement it or we don't. So I think, like, people have definitely learned there's a lot of interesting tools from a developer perspective that can be introduced in the software. SegWit was one of them. Like, I've always explained it to people as, like, it's kind of funny. Like, I think the first time I had someone next to me ask, like, what is SegWit at some kind of meetup or whatever. And this other guy started explaining the whole technical thing to him, and his face was just like, what the hell are you going on about? And I was like, dude, it's a tool for developers to be able to allow Bitcoin to scale. It's like a stepping stone towards innovation. That's all they need to know. And similar with Taproot, it's a stepping stone to be able to do privacy related things to, again, like help scalability and whatnot. And that's all that 99% of people need to know who even dare to ask that question. So in a similar way, there's tons of tools that we could introduce, but people have become a bit hesitant about these tools, and they're, again, like high time preference. They want to see results from those tools as soon as possible, because even Taproot itself, when it was implemented, took a while for developers to really start exploring how that could be used in various ways. And now a lot of people don't like, or a bunch of people don't like, what came out of that with ordinals and whatnot.
So I got stupid stamps on my blockchain.
Exactly. So then you get this whole kind of like ossification crowd of people who don't want to see any more changes. But for the most part, I think most reasonable people understand, like, hey, you can't just say we're not going to change anything anymore, but then at the same time have the ambition of everyone needs to be able to self-custody their Bitcoin. Yeah. So everyone kind of feels, for the most part, something needs to happen here. There are various directions we can think of. I would start getting worried if developers stop coming up with any kind of ideas. If they're just not seeing any kind of way out of it, if there's really nothing that can be done to help things improve and scale and become more private, like the brightest minds are out of gunpowder, so to speak, that's when I would worry. But until they keep coming up with interesting ideas and, like, while the momentum keeps going in development in general, personally, I'm not too worried about it. I'm just trying to do what I can to help educate people around some of these concepts. You are doing the same, to make sure that people don't listen as much to, the ones freaking out online and being very hysterical about Bitcoin being broken fundamentally and whatnot. Just being the bridge between the technical and the non-technical.
It's amazing how many translation problems there are. Just translation between developers and users, like at every level. Like not just like even across languages, but then across languages and groups, and then cultures, and then level of knowledge, and like just somebody asking what SegWit is, that could be a 50-minute conversation, or that could be 2 lines of this is what you need to know.
Exactly. And not everyone, like, especially, that's kind of why I got into Bitcoin, or like not why, but like how I got into it. Because initially when I learned about it, it took me quite a few months to properly understand it, because there was almost no non-technical documentation. Pretty much everyone into it was a very technical person. I was a young dude, no understanding of any of this stuff, very little understanding of economics either. And I was just like, I don't understand any of these people. And then along came Andreas Antonopoulos, who started speaking.
When did you get into it?
Like late 2013.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, he started giving presentations and whatnot. And then he was like, I was like, oh, someone I can understand. But I was like, well, if this is the only guy that someone like me can understand, then we probably need more of those guys. So maybe I can become a lesser version of him, or just do different stuff. So that's why I got into education around Bitcoin and why I stuck around.
Nice.
Because I realized there's going to be a big need for this stuff, or, it's never going to take off if it takes everyone like 3 to 6 months to understand what Bitcoin is, how a Lightning wallet works and whatnot.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going to be focusing a lot of my efforts on moving forward as well. It's just making that onboarding easier. So
Swan Bitcoin has the full suite of Bitcoin financial services. You can instantly buy, with your bank account or wire transfer, any amount of Bitcoin up to $10 million worth. And you can easily set up what I have been doing for ages, which is an automatic purchase of Bitcoin on a weekly or monthly basis. You just pick your time frame and then automatically withdraw it to your cold storage. And still they have free withdrawals to self-custody, which I was sure would be gone by now. But you should always treat any custodian as a point of failure. And luckily, you won't have to go anywhere for all of the information and advice you need for why you should withdraw and how to do it safely, because Swan Bitcoin has all of the resources you need and will regularly remind you. About 80% or more of their customers automatically withdraw their coins. That is an amazing feat, if you ask me. Then they also have the Swan IRA if you have a traditional IRA and you want to get it allocated to Bitcoin. And there's so much more. With Swan Private, they have inheritance planning. You also have Swan business accounts, and you can even do Bitcoin as a part of your employee benefit plans. They have an advisory. They have the Swan Vault, a multi-sig service for those who want to have the benefits of holding the majority of their keys, but still also want to be able to rely on a trusted institution in the case of an emergency or a disaster. If you haven't started into Bitcoin yet, Swan is an amazing place to begin. Go to swan.com/guy. The link will be right there in the description. Again, that is swan.com/guy. And they will know that I sent you, and my beautiful face will be right there at the top of the page to greet you. I am a longtime user myself, and a huge thank you to Swan for supporting this show, and I definitely recommend you check them out.
Sweet. Hell yeah. They need many, many, many more of us. Like I said, the translation problems are probably only going to get bigger, especially with AI and everything. Like the speed with which in fact, there was something I read recently. What was this from? God, it's the worst when you just have like this stack. But it was something about how, like, why technological revolutions take so long when certain technologies actually, from the theoretical standpoint, obviously could move at an aggressive rate, like
I love
way faster. And it was specifically because of the time, like the limitation of the technological revolution isn't the technology. It's the fact that people have to understand what the technology is and how to use it. And that literally takes basically a generation. It takes like 10 to 20 years every single time.
So earlier last year, I actually wrote about this because I did another report on Bitcoin versus the global payments industry.
Yeah.
And I just really wanted to make the point clear with all these people who have the expectation that within a few years, a large percentage of the global population is going to switch over to using Bitcoin for payments. So I looked into the global stats in there, and I obviously don't recall them off the top of my head, but I had some things where basically, if everyone was fully informed today on what their options are for different cross-border payments, then the average fee that people pay for cross-border payments would drop from, and this is just with traditional payments means, it would drop from about 6.2 to 3.2% on average. So just if people knew better how to use international fiat rails, like various apps, solutions, etc.,
stuff that's been around forever,
then it could already improve that much, indeed. And I also had some stats in there around e-commerce, how there were, I don't recall the exact numbers, but they were really staggering how a very large percentage of people have just never done an e-commerce transaction whatsoever.
Really?
So just knowing that, and like obviously this evolves over time in a lot of countries, but there were still a whole bunch of countries where that's just not a thing, like where relatively few people are doing that. And as a result, like knowing that, that people have never bought something online before, like how are they going to switch over to Bitcoin? They're barely doing digital payments.
They don't even have, it's like teaching somebody how to tie their shoes and they're like, I don't have shoes. Like, oh man, that's crazy.
That takes time. I think like I'm going to quickly search
Yeah, what's the name of that article?
So it's Bitcoin versus the $156 trillion global payments industry. Is that report? So I have the data point here. I just found it in the report. And it basically said that an estimated 39% of the global population over the age of 15 had made a payment to a digital merchant in 2021 globally. So that means that 2/3 of the global adult population just doesn't do e-commerce.
Wow.
A lot of people just buy their stuff locally, obviously. And it seems so impossible to believe. But then if you understand a bit like how the global population is distributed, how you have tons of people in Asia and very densely packed countries where there's just a lot of stuff that you need available locally, then that cuts out a really big part. And then obviously just families living together, you'll have one person in the family doing the online shopping versus everyone there. So ultimately, that's the one you might want to educate about Bitcoin. And it might not initially be the other part of the family. Similar to what you were saying with Vediment, that will be concentrated around. You might just have a couple people in the village who are more digitally inclined, and they'll do this stuff. And it's not going to be the entire community there necessarily that starts doing this. That could take a couple more decades, a couple more generations.
Yeah, for sure. Do you mind sending me a link to that? I wrote down the title, but just so I can have it. I'm curious. You said this is about a year ago?
Close to. No, I was released in like June or something like that, I think.
Okay. Well, sweet. No, I'll definitely check that one out. Thank you.
I'll send it to you right away.
I'm curious as well. Regulation. You mentioned being in a first world country a couple of times. Yeah. And then we caveated a little bit later of ascending and descending. Regulate a handful of regulations have kind of come across the pipeline that seem a little bit crazy to me, especially like the IRS in the $10,000 any and all $10,000 transactions. Like you have to get social security number, name, details, everything like that. And it seems like such a profound misunderstanding of what a push system is. Like I could receive 10,000. Technically, Sam, if you want to do this, you could send me $10,000 denominated in Bitcoin right now, and I would have no idea. I am encouraging you. And I would have no idea it was you. Like there's nothing I can do to stop the payment. I have no control over it. You are the one with the control over that Bitcoin, and you should send it to me the next time you think about this. But how does that factor into, maybe specifically at River, since you have internal conversations with people? What do you do about that? And in Lightning, as much as $10,000 payments don't really happen over Lightning, well, I am doing 500, and I've even done 1,000 or more dollar denominated payments over Lightning now. And every year the price goes up, I have more liquidity, and I don't have to do anything for that extra liquidity, especially denominated in $10,000 in dollars. When they start coming through, like that seems like a regulation that's so completely out of the scope of, I just have no idea how this works. How would you even address it? Is that even a concern right now? Do you just kind of expect that that's just going to make this whole thing, not Lightning and Bitcoin and stuff, but just like their idea of like, this is how we're going to regulate things, implode on itself or by itself? I don't know. What's the thoughts? What's the general thoughts on those sorts of things?
It's a hard one because you're really like, how are they going to take this in?
Yeah.
What are they going to come up with? You can get a vague idea, like it's going to be as evasive as possible, likely, and as annoying as possible, because also like Lightning is not at the scale yet where, it's so big that they feel like, oh, we're really going to disrupt so much stuff here if we mess too much with it. Like Bitcoin is now kind of at this scale where they're realizing, I think probably more so with the ETFs coming in, people are just realizing like, okay, we can't just, like the US banning it at this point, like very few people believe that's even a realistic possibility.
Yeah.
So, or like outlawing it in some kind of roundabout way, which was recently discussed, I think, with Elizabeth Warren on like proposals and whatnot. So it's a bit less likely to happen there. I could see them be difficult about Lightning and trying to restrict that in various ways. But yeah, it's like, we're always evaluating the risks and things that might happen in the future. I think in general, for now, it's just like wait and see what comes up. And in the meantime, just keep building and innovating and like get ahead of the regulation in a way so that when things get pulled back, that they can't pull it back as far anymore because the technology is just superior to whatever opinion people end up having. That's, I think, a bit of the general thinking. But, that's a thought, that's an ambition, that's a goal, but making it happen in reality will be pretty hard as well.
Yeah, for sure. But I guess that's always been kind of the cypherpunk perspective is like, well, maybe we can build faster than they can even figure out what to do about it.
Exactly. Yep.
Just keep it up. And honestly, with AI on the scene, it's crazy. This is more AI Unchained content, but the R1, the little rabbit. Did you see the little device?
Yep.
So the big thing that I think, and I'll probably do an episode about this. I don't see how I don't. The big thing from that was their new LAM as opposed to LLM, the large action model. Like as we get to a point where you can teach AI to just use the program that you use, and it can execute actions and perform tasks within that program, like I don't know. I haven't seen anything about it, but have you seen any indication of AI entering the sort of channel management and like Lightning software space at all yet? Because I see that outside of the potential risks, I see that as an insanely powerful tool for, rather than giving someone some automated piece of software in the sense that there's a bunch of if this, then that sort of structure of like how to manage your channels. You could literally have something that kind of learns. Like it can look at the data itself and decide what worked and what didn't, and then make quote unquote manual adjustments automatically. So not only just in the sense of technology that this could basically feed back on itself at an aggressive rate for the people who understand how to implement this, but more just like on the ground. Have you seen any of this yet? I know we're super, super early on any sort of implementation, but I was just curious.
Yeah. I think like as far as AI goes, I think Lightning Labs was the one talking about that the most, and just trying to get trying to get a bit of momentum going there to make people think about how could we start building solutions that interact with this. So I think it's good to kind of evangelize a bit and see like, does anything creative come out of that? I don't think I've really seen it being used much in practice because for the most part, all the rebalancing stuff, they're relatively simple rules, I think, for the most part that have been used so far. And people are seeing good enough results from that. And I would say like that what's also the payoff. Like if you had an AI that was even better at rebalancing and figuring out what channels to open and like where to have your flows come in and whatnot.
How much does it matter?
What's the actual payoff? And if you look at River, I think we also have numbers in the report that I added from what we're earning on the Bitcoin that we have in there. And it's a relatively low amount. It's like 1% per year. If you are someone who's manually doing this and super dedicated, like historically, I've seen people who are earning like over 10% per year, but still that is, if that's a full-time job or something, at least you're spending a significant amount of time on, it's called a part-time project or something, then still that's a lot of time that you're putting in to earn 10%. And that also doesn't scale infinitely. At some point, it just caps off and there's only so much liquidity.
Diminishing marginal returns, most likely. Yeah.
Yep. Yes, sir. So I think from that perspective, like as long as there is some kind of limitation there is a bit less need as well for AI to come in there and to really maximize that. If Lightning would continue to grow significantly and those kind of numbers start picking up, then it gets super interesting, I think, for everyone involved as well. So that would then be a bit of a next step to level that up.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. It might make more sense that even though that could be like really great when you're looking at it from like kind of a service provision side, and if you have a set of rules that are simple enough that you can automate it with just a basic script, then you don't get an outsized advantage to have an AI do it. And then kind of going back to your idea of like how much, if people just use the fiat rails properly that are available right now, they can go from 6% to 3%. There's probably so many larger advantages of just doing simple techniques and utilizing simple tools that are and have been available, rather than trying to figure out some new AI thing in that context.
And this is so often the case. It's just, just regular automation already makes such a big difference. And in the discussion earlier on, like what are the trends that we're seeing? How long does it take to adopt certain technologies? Just very often you realize it's like stuff is not even automated or done in some old school process. And even automating it, like it doesn't pay itself back that easily in lots of cases either. So lots of stuff just doesn't get automated and continues to be done manually. So that, is also very much the case with AI, where people in general, since the AI sort of revolution with, a lot of large language models coming up and whatnot, and image generation, people just very quickly see the dystopian future of this stuff is going to take over everything. But like sort of the more on the ground you are and the more you try to use it, like earlier today, I was just struggling with ChatGPT so hard. Like I was just, just asking it, like, how much Bitcoin is there going to be by the year 2050, for example, if we're currently at this block? And like, there's halvings and whatnot, which it also knows, it looks up. Yeah. It just gives you a completely wrong answer. And it goes like, it projects it over 21 million.
Yeah.
And then it says in the same sentence, like, assuming, that, or knowing that there will only be 21 million Bitcoin. And I'm like,
knowing there will only be 21 million, there will be about 22 and a half.
Dude, you're literally like saying the opposite thing. You're like, you're contradicting yourself. You're saying that you can only go up to 21 million. But then you're showing me 21 and a half or something.
Yeah.
And you pointed out, it's like, oh yeah, I'll rerun it. It reruns it. And again, you get a completely wrong result. And you just give up. So with a lot of these things, it's like, this takes time, people. As exciting and as flashy as it is, every impressive thing that you see with technology.
Rough. It's still rough.
Yeah, it's so much time and effort.
It's always going to be the rough version in a sense.
Goes into that, yep.
Yeah. So. It's funny about ChatGPT specifically. The funny thing is when you're having a conversation, a trick to do for something like that, if you're trying to actually get that information, is think about it in the context of like the conversation is you're asking it to make connections between words, and you want the connections in those words to perform a math problem. So what instead you do, or whenever I run into a problem exactly like this, I ran into this doing like a little cipher thing for a clue hunt for a Christmas present. I did it with ChatGPT. It could not do a simple substitution cipher at all. Like it did it for like 4 letters, and then the whole rest of the stuff was just garbled nonsense. And the reason is because it starts trying to just guess the weight from the letter, and it just does a language model weighting, not a cipher weighting. So what I had, every time I'll say, can you write me a simple script that predicts the Bitcoin block height, or excuse me, the amount of Bitcoin at this point, assuming halvings and this block height and this, and this. And sometimes you can say, can you write me a script? And then the next question, can you execute this script? Can you run this and give me the result? And it will actually give you the result. It's not always the case. And I'm not sure what the thing is there, but
what it gave me in this case as well was actually, you can click on you have this little button where it's like CD analysis, and then you look at that, and behind that is just a script. It's not showing it to you, but it is behind that, and you're just looking through that. It's just wrong, So then you point out, like, fix this script. And then again, it just goes off and does something that it's not supposed to do. And it
doesn't work every time. It doesn't work every time.
Technology takes time. Like people are, no matter what we invent for Bitcoin, like it doesn't matter what we do. We're not going to get the entire world on it within a couple of years. It's just not a thing.
Yeah, it's not possible.
And people need to find their peace with that and do their parts to help make it happen, I think. It's just being realistic.
I really like Alex Vetsky's theory of the 3 generations theory. Did you ever read that piece?
I did not, but I can get a general gist of what it's going to be.
It's really good, and it's basically about like that the mental shift is the more important thing, and then the understanding the technology, like smartphones didn't really become smartphones until you had a generation grow up that they had it when they were 8, and they didn't know a world without it. And then when they were 20, everything was on smartphones, and that, and I can't remember exactly the details of why. It was a very, very solid argument of why it's 3 generations, and obviously mean that in the sense of like the 10 to 15 year like span. Yep. So 30 years out is where we should be looking for a hyper Bitcoinized world, essentially, is roughly the argument. Yep. And it's also, God, it lends back to the thing we talked about earlier with the medium of exchange thing. And then also kind of the whole atomic networks idea is that like it didn't make it, it was very early on. Like you got in 2013. So you saw that like first initial, and probably remember as well or better than I do, that first like jump of like, oh, the merchants are all going to have Bitcoin. And we had like Overstock, and we had Newegg and all this stuff. It was like, it was happening. It's all happening.
Every day
right
I went
now
on Reddit, there was a new company name that I'd never heard of that now accepted Bitcoin.
Yep. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, like kind of like in my phase where I was trying to like post-mortem, like what happened there and why did it stop? Where I was like, oh no, this is never, like we're so far out from this. Like not only do we need a new layer first, but and thinking about it more in the context of what I've been reading recently is that it suffers from the most potent network density problems. If you have 4 businesses in your area, like in like your city that accept Lightning, you might as well have none. But you could have tens of thousands all around the world and still have a network that is completely useless from the context of a medium of exchange. Like you could boast 100,000 businesses now accept Lightning and Bitcoin payments. Nothing. You're just completely useless in that context.
You go into one of those stores and they're like, what is this? I've not actually done this.
Yeah. You're the first person to ever cross the network to actually meet us and do this payment. So I've already left you or pulled you a little bit over time. I don't want to take too much of your time here. Dude, first,
I gotta go in a moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. But I wanted to finish this up with 2 things. One, can you tell the audience anything that you want them to know, how to find you, things that are coming up? And then 2, I want to know what you've been reading recently or something that you recommend as a reading option.
You can find me on Twitter. I'm also on Nostr, but more passively, just following things, not posting as much. But on Twitter, I'm at SD Wouters, or just look for Sam Wouters, and then you'll find it on there.
Link will be in the show notes.
Yeah. The stuff that I write can be found on River. I also work on River Learn, which is a big database of all kinds of articles on which people can learn about basic Bitcoin concepts. And as for what I've been reading, thing I tend to do is in my spare time, I don't read a lot of nonfiction. I mostly read fiction because I already spend my days reading
technical papers,
nonfiction. yeah, like just all over it, I think. But I've been like, in general, I've been spending a bunch of time on Midjourney as well. And rather than reading books about it, a lot of those, types of tutorials and things, like they're much more video focused or much more like, here's a PDF with some like a great workflow to go through and to try out yourself. So I've been enjoying a lot of that stuff because it's a bit more actionable. Whereas with reading, I love the part that makes you think so deep. And I can tell, like, from all the people I've met in my life, I can really tell you are super deep into this and just like moving between all these books and reading them at the same time even. So sometimes I just like to step away from that and just figure out something like, what's an actionable thing I can do here and play around with. And it's a different type of learning, I guess. So it doesn't concretely answer your question of like, oh, this is an amazing book, but that's just what I've been doing more of, rather than like, let me pick up another book here and just like absorb all this information. It's like, just trying
looking
to push
for
myself
actionable
to,
information.
Pick up a bit more of a different flow of learning, to change things up a bit. Because I've been listening to so many podcasts for years, and it's nice to do when you go on walks or you're doing chores around the house or whatever. But sometimes I'm also like, let's learn something new or do something practical here as a different way to learn stuff. And that's,
there's a lot in the podcast space that like you can't, and I run into this problem a lot, is like I can't expect people to be sitting down at a computer. So there's a whole range of things of like kind of hands-on stuff that just will never come through an audio. It's got a lot of the benefits of like not having to have hands-on like reading a book, but then a lot of the drawbacks of not having like kind of the video, like sitting in front, like the environment in which people listen to it, so like everything kind of has its place.
Yep. One book I can shout out to that or at least like I'm really curious about it, the one that Aaron van Weerdam just released, the Genesis book.
Yes.
That's definitely one I'll be curious to.
Oh yes. In fact, I've been meaning to see if he is
I haven't read it yet, so that's the only caveat I should add. But
the Genesis book. But I haven't read it yet either. And I know I've read like pretty much every piece that he's read about or written about cypherpunk history or whatever, and it's probably a lot in there, but still I'm stoked about this book. Yeah, thank you for that one, actually. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, dude. And if you could hang out for just a second after this, just to make sure it uploads. But seriously, it was wonderful having you on the show. I'm glad we finally did this. And maybe we will have something to talk about again in a year or two with new developments in Lightning and a new layer 3, all sorts of cool stuff. So
thanks everybody, a lot for having me. It was fun.
100%, man. Everybody follow Sam. Links and all those details will be in the show notes.